Both pilots were dead. The plane was falling. The only person who could fly it was an 11-year-old black boy from Detroit who had never set foot on an airplane in his life. 31,000 feet above Lake Michigan, Delta Connection 2208 drifted into a slow, quiet dive. Captain James Wilson was slumped against the side window, skin the color of cold ash, lips already turning blue. First Officer Jennifer Taylor had fallen forward onto her yoke. Her hands stopped halfway to an oxygen mask she never reached. A cracked valve behind them was still whispering poison into the cockpit. In the captain's seat, a boy in a grape-stained Goodwill hoodie gripped the yoke with both hands. His sneakers barely touched the rudder pedals. On the pedestal in front of him lay a pencil-written notebook his grandfather had left him, open to a dog-eared page. 6,500 hours in a simulator, 0 hours in the sky, 30 souls behind him, one breath left to decide. I've been chewing on this story for a week, and I still can't shake it. Name's Kane Uncovers. I'm the guy who hunts down the kind of... And the part that's gonna get you. It's not the landing. It never is. 3 hours earlier, the sun had not yet come up over East Warren Avenue. Brandon Williams was awake anyway. He had been awake since 4:15, because that was what he did on days that mattered. He sat cross-legged on the carpet of his bedroom, the one bedroom in the one-bedroom apartment he shared with his grandmother, and he was running his cold start checklist out loud into the dark. Battery, on. External power, on. Beacon, on. APU master, start. APU fuel valve, open. The Dell Inspiron laptop on the floor in front of him was a 2016 model with a duct-taped hinge, and the X-Plane 12 cockpit on its screen was a Bombardier CRJ 700 that he had rebuilt, panel by panel, from memory. The Thrustmaster joystick wedged between his knees was held together with 2 wraps of black electrical tape. Over his bed, pinned to the drywall with sewing pins, was a printed chart of the ILS approach into Detroit Metro, folded at the part that showed the decision altitude. He had drawn a small star in pencil next to the runway heading. He had put the star there when he was 9. Above the chart, at a slight angle, there was a photograph. A man in a tan Air Force dress shirt, smiling with his mouth closed. Staff Sergeant Elijah Williams, crew chief, C-130 Hercules, Brandon's grandfather. Dead 5 years now. In the kitchen, his grandmother was already frying eggs. Ruth Williams was 72 years old, and she cleaned office buildings for a living. Mondays, she cleaned the lobby of Comerica Tower downtown. Thursdays, she cleaned a dental office out in Dearborn. She had worked the night shift the night before, come home at 3 a.m., slept for an hour, and gotten up to make her grandson breakfast before she drove him to the airport in a 15-year-old Chevy with a driver's side door that only opened from the inside. "Eat," she said, when Brandon came out of the bedroom with his backpack over one shoulder. "You don't eat, you get airsick. I looked it up." He ate. 2 eggs, a piece of toast, a gas station honey bun because she had bought it for him as a joke last night, and it had become a good luck thing. On the counter sat a paper boarding pass, laminated at the library branch on Mack Avenue. The pass said, Brandon Williams, minor, unaccompanied, Delta Connection 2208, DTW to Milwaukee, connecting onward to Oshkosh for the EAA Young Eagles summer camp. He had won his seat at that camp with an 800-word essay titled, Why Altitude is a Promise. Ruth drove him in the dark. At the gate, Concourse A, Gate A18, just after sunrise, she bent down and straightened the collar of his hoodie. "Your granddad would be proud," she whispered. He nodded. He did not say anything back. He did not trust his voice. She watched him walk down the jet bridge with the other passengers. He was the smallest person in line by 1.5 feet. In seat 3A, a woman named Catherine Anderson watched him board from behind the rim of a vodka tonic she was not going to finish. She was 53. She was a partner at Whitfield and Grant LLP, billable rate $1,250 an hour,
and she had been rebooked onto this regional jet in the middle of the night after her Atlanta connection canceled. Her Louis Vuitton briefcase was on the floor by her feet. Her suit had not wrinkled. Nothing about her had wrinkled in a long time.
When Brandon passed her row on the way back to 14C, she turned to Maria Brooks, the lead flight attendant, and she said quietly, "Is that child traveling alone?" Maria smiled. "He's a minor passenger, ma'am, pre-boarded. We keep an eye on them." Catherine watched him find his seat. She watched him take off his backpack, very carefully, and tuck it under the seat in front of him. She watched him pull out a library copy of Stick and Rudder with the barcode still on the spine. She did not smile. In the cockpit, 11 rows ahead of her, Captain James Wilson was running the same checklist Brandon had whispered into his bedroom carpet an hour before. His first officer, Jennifer Taylor, was 34 years old and engaged to be married in May. She wrinkled her nose. "James," she said, "you smell that?" "De-icing fluid," he said. "They were spraying when we pushed back." "It's sweet, like melted sugar." "That's de-ice," he said again, without looking up. The cracked bleed air valve on the number 2 engine began, very quietly, to open. 29 minutes after takeoff, the smell in the cockpit went quiet. The seatbelt sign went off at 10,000 feet, and Catherine Anderson unbuckled hers. She did not need to. She did it anyway. She leaned across the aisle, across the empty seat of 3B, where her assistant should have been sitting, and she looked at Brandon Williams the way she looked at junior associates in a deposition she was about to win. "Traveling alone, sweetheart?" she said. "Does your mother know where you are?" Brandon looked up from Stick and Rudder. He closed the book over his thumb, the way he had been taught to hold a page. "My grandmother put me on the plane, ma'am," he said. "She's proud of me." "That's not what I asked." "It's what I have, ma'am." She did not know what to do with that. She sat back. Maria Brooks came by a minute later with the drink cart. She looked at Brandon and at the book on his lap, and then she leaned down and spoke a little more slowly than she had spoken to the man in 14D. "Would you like some headphones, honey, for the movie? I can show you how to plug them in if you need help." "I have my own, ma'am. Thank you." She gave him a pair anyway, sealed in plastic. He took them and said thank you again. She came back 8 minutes later and offered him a second pair, because she had forgotten the first time. He took that pair too. He did not correct her. In 12B, a 52-year-old man named Daniel Miller leaned into Brandon's space and asked if Brandon would mind swapping seats because Daniel's knees hurt and the middle row was more generous. Brandon said yes. He moved to 14C. He did not ask for anything in exchange. When he was resettled, he opened a small spiral notebook of his own and began to write numbers down the left margin in a clean, straight hand. Altitude, 310. Airspeed, 370. Outside air, -42. Wind, 220 at 42. He did not know why he was writing them. He had been writing them for 5 years, every time he flew a simulator, and he had not known how to stop. Across the aisle from him, in 9D, a 31-year-old woman named Sarah Brown was rocking her 8-month-old daughter, Lily, whose cheek had found the soft spot on Sarah's collarbone and gone still. In 22A, a man named Peter Johnson was sweating more than the cabin warranted. His fingers were trembling on the armrest. He did not know it yet, but his blood sugar was dropping, and it had been dropping since the gate. In 14D, one seat behind Brandon, a 68-year-old man named George Davis watched Brandon's page of numbers with a small, careful interest. George had worked 32 years at Delta's Tech Ops hangar in Atlanta, and he had seen this handwriting before. This was the handwriting of a kid who had been taught to talk to an airplane. He had seen it on flight deck checklists and on the margins of manuals. He had never seen it on an 11-year-old. He caught Brandon's eye. He touched the brim of his cap. Brandon nodded back. In the cockpit, Captain Wilson keyed the mic for Minneapolis Center and asked for a step climb to flight level 350. Minneapolis Center, Delta 2208, request flight level 350. The syllables slurred, just slightly, just enough. At his station in Sector 23 at the Minneapolis ARTCC, Thomas Walker, 61 years old, 35 years of service, 2 months from retirement, made a small pencil note on his scratch log. Pilot sounds tired. He approved the climb. In the cockpit, First Officer Taylor yawned. She yawned again. She yawned a third time, inside 40 seconds. Neither of them touched their oxygen mask. The sweet smell had been there long enough now that it did not smell like anything at all. In 14C, Brandon finished his column of numbers and drew a small line underneath, the way his grandfather's notebook had taught him. He put the cap back on his pencil. He looked out the window at a cloud that looked like a shoulder. He did not know it yet, but he was the only pilot left on the airplane. The airplane began to sink at 9:23 in the morning. It did not sink the way movies show an airplane sink. There was no lurch. There was no alarm. The autopilot was still holding altitude the last time it could, and then it could not, and the needle on the altimeter began, very slowly, to unwind. 31,000, 30,900, 30,800, 90 seconds. Brandon felt it first in his ears. A softness, a pressure that had not been there. He looked up at the overhead bulkhead screen, the little passenger info screen that showed altitude in white numbers on a blue field, and he saw the numbers moving in the wrong direction. 2 rows behind him, a toddler started to cry. Brandon reached into his backpack. He pulled out the spiral notebook his grandfather had written for him when he was 6. How to Talk to a Tower. The cover was held together with Scotch tape. He put it on his lap and he put his left hand on it flat, the way his grandfather had taught him to put his hand on his chest before saying anything important. Then he unbuckled his seatbelt. Up the aisle, Maria Brooks was standing at the forward galley curtain. Her smile was the kind of smile flight attendants are trained to wear in the first 30 seconds of a problem, before they know if it is a problem. She rapped her knuckles against the flight deck door in the crew pattern. 3, 2, 1. She waited. She knocked again. The same pattern. Nothing. Her smile went away. "Excuse me." Brandon was at her elbow. She looked down at him, and then down farther, because he was shorter than she had remembered. "Honey, go sit back down, please." "Ma'am." He kept his voice level. "The plane has been descending for 90 seconds, and the crew isn't answering the door. That means the crew can't answer the door. Post 911 procedure. You have the override keypad code. You should use it." She stared at him. "How old are you?" 11, ma'am. We don't have time for that question." Behind them, Catherine Anderson was on her feet. Her face was white. "What is going on? Somebody tell me what is going on." "Sit down, Catherine." George Davis had stood up too. "Sit down, ma'am. Let the boy talk." "He's a child." "He's the only person on this plane who's said the right thing so far. Let him talk." Maria's hands were shaking. She punched the override code into the keypad. The lock cycled. The door swung inward. Brandon stepped around her. The smell hit him first. Sweet. Like a candy factory on fire. He had read about it once, in a pilot's memoir about an incident over Cyprus. Carbon monoxide, colorless, odorless by itself, but the fuel that carried it had a sweetness to it that a trained nose could catch. Then he saw the seats. Captain Wilson was slumped sideways, his head against the side window, his mouth slightly open. His skin was gray. First Officer Taylor was folded forward over her yoke, her hair falling across her face. Her left hand stopped in the air halfway between her lap and the quick-dawn oxygen mask bracket on the side wall. Brandon put 2 fingers on Captain Wilson's wrist, the way his grandfather had written on page 8 of the notebook. "Check pulse for 10 seconds. He counted to 10. Nothing. He moved to First Officer Taylor. He moved her hair gently away from her neck, and he pressed 2 fingers into the soft place under the angle of her jaw, because her arms were still folded under her. He counted to 10. Nothing. He stood up. He turned around. Maria was in the cockpit doorway. Her eyes were enormous. He said, softly, "They're gone." She covered her mouth. "Maria," his voice did not rise. Oxygen masks. The quick dawn ones. Put one on. I need one too. She moved. She pulled the mask off its hook on the side wall and pushed it across to him. He slipped the harness over his head, tightened it, and breathed in. Pure, cold oxygen flooded his lungs. He hadn't realized he had been breathing shallow until he wasn't anymore. He reached up. He found the overhead panel. He had memorized this panel on a laptop in Detroit, and he turned off the number 2 engine bleed. The fresh outflow air replaced the sweet smell inside 30 seconds. A small red ECAM message appeared, and Brandon acknowledged it with a thumb. Then, carefully, with George Davis in the jump seat now behind him, they moved First Officer Taylor out of the right seat and down to the cockpit floor, and they covered her with a Navy cabin blanket, the way you cover someone you intend to respect. Captain Wilson they left where he was for the moment. They would move him in a minute. Not yet. Brandon slid into the right seat. He looked at the autopilot. Green. Altitude hold. Still engaged. Still working. Still the only thing keeping 30 lives out of Lake Michigan. He reached for the radio. He tuned backup frequency 121.5. He pressed the mic. Catherine Anderson was in the cockpit doorway now. Her hands were clasped in front of her like a schoolgirl's. Her voice was the smallest he had ever heard it. "Brandon, what can I do?" He did not turn around. "Ma'am, you can stay in the doorway. Only if you read me numbers when I ask. Nothing else." She stayed. He keyed the mic. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." I keep rewinding this part in my head. 11 years old, 2 fingers on a dead man's wrist, and the kid doesn't scream. He takes inventory. I've choked on way less in my own life. And this boy's about to fly a regional jet. Walker heard it on his headset at 9:26 and 34 seconds. He had been drinking a cup of cold coffee. He almost spat it. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Minneapolis Center, Delta Connection 2208. Both pilots deceased. Repeat, deceased. Passenger at the controls. Student simulator pilot. No certificate. Request emergency vectors and a controller who can talk me down." The voice was a boy's voice. Walker pushed his chair back an inch from the console. He pulled his boom mic closer to his mouth, and he took 2 seconds before he keyed the transmit switch. Because he had been in this chair for 35 years, and he had learned that 2 seconds spent well is worth more than the best phrase you can think of in one. "Delta 2208, Minneapolis Center. Say again your souls on board and your fuel state." 30 souls, sir, including me. Fuel, 5,400 pounds. Altitude, 30,800. Heading, 290. Airspeed, 340. Squawking, 7700. Autopilot engaged. Altitude hold active. Walker closed his eyes for half a second. This was not a prank. Pranksters did not know how to squawk 7700. Pranksters did not report fuel in pounds. He keyed his mic. 2208, son. How old are you? And who taught you to talk to me like that? A pause. I'm 11, sir. X-Plane 12, 6,500 hours logged. CRJ systems memorized. My granddad taught me the radio before he passed. Son, what was your granddad's name? Another pause. When the voice came back, it was smaller. Staff Sergeant Elijah Williams, United States Air Force. Crew Chief, C-130 Hercules. 1968 to 1988. Walker put his hand over his mouth. He pressed a side button and spoke to his supervisor on the hotline. Barry, Sector 23. I need the FAA Great Lakes region on the phone. I've got a miner at the controls of a CRJ 700 with both pilots down, and he sounds better than half my regionals. I want operations. I want the Delta dispatcher. I want the kid's grandmother on a cell phone. Get it done. He pulled his mic back. He made his voice quiet. He made it what his own father had sounded like when his father had taught him to drive a car. Delta 2208, I read you, son. Altitude 30800, heading 290, autopilot engaged. My name is Tom Walker. I have 35 years in this chair. I am going to be your co-pilot today, and we are going to go home together. Confirm. A breath on the line. Confirm, sir. Co-pilot Walker. In the cockpit doorway, Catherine Anderson heard the word grandfather and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. She did not make a sound. She did not make a sound for the next 20 minutes. Brandon's own hands, on the yoke, were perfectly still. 1,000 miles south, his grandmother was scrubbing a dental office sink and did not yet know her boy was flying the plane. They moved Captain Wilson at 9:34. George Davis and Maria Brooks did it. They unbuckled his harness slowly, because slow was respect, and they lifted him under his arms and behind his knees, and they carried him, together, 6 steps back to the forward galley, where they laid him on the floor against the bulkhead and covered him with a second navy blanket and folded his hands across his chest. Neither of them spoke. Maria was crying. George was not. George had buried both of his brothers in uniform, and he knew that right now, crying was not what the men behind him needed from him. When they came back, Brandon was already in the left seat. He had slid across the center pedestal on his belly rather than stand up and walk around, because standing up and walking around meant not looking at the cockpit, and right now, he could not afford to stop looking at the cockpit. He was in the captain's chair. His seatbelt was fastened. His sneakers were on the rudder pedals, and the pedals were not adjusted forward enough, because the pedals had been set for a man 6 feet tall. He was 48 inches. He put both hands on the yoke the way he had seen his grandfather's friend Walter Dupree do once, at an air show in Willow Run when Brandon was 7. Light. Like you were holding a bird that had landed on you by accident. Before he touched anything else, he did something no camera would ever record. He turned his head to the right, to the place where First Officer Taylor had been lying on the cockpit floor under the blanket, and he said, very softly, "Thank you, ma'am." He turned his head to the left, to the empty captain's seat he was now sitting in, where Captain Wilson had been 12 minutes before, and he said, "Thank you, sir." The open microphone on the panel was not keyed. Only Thomas Walker, whose finger had slipped onto the push-to-talk on his end of the line, heard it. Walker did not tell anyone about that for 3 years. Brandon keyed his mic. "Tom, cockpit secured. Both crew members respectfully relocated. I'm in the left seat now. Autopilot still engaged. Altitude 30800. Heading 290. Fuel 5,350 pounds. Burn rate, normal." "Copy that, son. Nice work." George Davis slid into the jump seat behind Brandon. He buckled in. He did not say anything. He was there to be useful, and Brandon knew it. Catherine Anderson was still in the cockpit doorway. Her knuckles on the frame were bone white. "Ma'am," Brandon said without turning, "I need one thing from you." "Anything." "On the overhead panel, there's a display that says CABALT. It's a number. Right now it reads 8.3. Every 30 seconds, I need you to read it to me. If it moves more than 0.2, either direction, I need you to say it louder. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Then please start." 8.3. "Thank you, ma'am." Walker came back on the frequency. "Delta 2208, Minneapolis Center. Nearest suitable field is Cherry Capital Airport, Traverse City, Michigan. Identifier Tango Victor Charlie. Runway 28, 6,500 feet available. Emergency services staged. I'm going to vector you there. Turn right heading 310. Descend and maintain 10,000. Right 310, down to 10,000. Delta 2208. Brandon did not touch the autopilot yet. He reached up. He turned the heading bug on the MCP to 310, slowly, with his thumb. He dialed the altitude down to 10,000. He clicked the VS wheel to minus 1,800 feet per minute. The CRJ's nose dipped into the new heading, and for the first time since he had sat down, the airplane was descending on purpose. 8.3, Catherine said behind him. Out in the cabin, Maria was handling 26 passengers by herself. Sarah Brown had Lily on her chest, face inward, and she was humming something Brandon's grandmother had hummed to him once when he had strep throat. In 22A, Peter Johnson had started to hyperventilate. He stood up, on the 4th degree of descent, and lunged for the overwing exit handle. 3 passengers grabbed him. A young woman with a nose ring got an arm around his shoulders. A man in a business suit put a hand on his chest. Daniel Miller. The same Daniel Miller who had taken Brandon's window seat 2 hours before, held Peter's other arm, gently. And Daniel Miller, 52 years old, with a mortgage and a wife and a daughter in college, said, "Brother, look at me. We're okay. The kids got it. We're okay." Catherine heard the commotion. She stepped out of the cockpit doorway for exactly 90 seconds. She was not a lawyer right then. She had been a nurse in the medical ICU at Henry Ford Hospital for 4 years before law school, and some part of her, the part that knew how to read the color of a person's lips, recognized what she was looking at. She knelt beside Peter. She looked at his pupils. She took his wrist. She smelled his breath. She called back to Maria over her shoulder. "Juice. Orange juice, apple juice, any juice. Glucose tablets if you have them. He's hypo. He's not insane." Maria found a can of apple juice in the drink cart. Catherine held it to Peter's lips and tilted it. 90 seconds later, his hands had stopped shaking. She came back to the cockpit doorway. 8.3. "Thank you, ma'am." "Brandon." "Yes, ma'am." "What's your name again?" "Brandon Williams, ma'am." A pause. A long one. The autopilot altitude alerter beeped as they passed through 25,000 feet. "I'm sorry." He did not turn around. He did not make her do the work of being looked at. "It's all right, ma'am. Just keep reading me the pressure." 8.3. In the jump seat, George Davis was watching the hydraulic synoptic page on the center display, and his face had changed. "Brandon." "Yes, sir." "You've got an amber caution on hydraulic system 2. I don't like it. You're going to have partial flaps on final. Plan for it." "How partial, Mr. Davis?" "Call me George, son. 20 degrees max. You'll be landing faster than the book wants. VREF plus 15. "Copy that, George." Brandon breathed out. He wrote a number on the corner of his grandfather's notebook, which was open on the center pedestal next to the quick reference handbook. VREF plus 15. 150 knots over the fence. Maria came forward. She was carrying a printed sheet of paper, still warm from the ACARS printer. "Emergency services want a revised passenger manifest, honey, for triage staging, in case." Brandon took the sheet. He laid it on his knee and glanced down it, not to read it, but to make sure it was complete. His own name was on line 29. Williams, Brandon, minor, unaccompanied, passenger. He did not say anything. He handed the sheet back. George Davis, from the jump seat, watching him, spoke very low. "Kid, you got hands. Don't let anybody on this earth tell you different. Ever again." "Yes, sir." Behind him, quietly, in the cockpit doorway, Catherine Anderson said, 8.3. Somewhere over northern Michigan, a small boy who had not been visible to her 2 hours ago was flying a jet through her life and into everyone else's. The only way down was to trust the boy they had all ignored. Walker's voice came back at 19,000 feet. "Brandon, weather update for Traverse City. It's not what we hoped for. Ceiling 800 overcast. Visibility 1¼ miles. Winds 220 at 22, gusting 30. Runway 28 is wet, below visual minimums. You're going to need a full ILS approach in actual instrument conditions." Brandon was quiet for 3 seconds. He was quiet because he was running 5 problems in parallel in his head, and he had learned from his grandfather's notebook, page 22, that when you have 5 problems, you name them out loud before you solve them. He keyed the mic. "Tom, I have 5 problems. Tell me if I've missed one." "Go." 1. Partial flaps, 20 degrees max. Hydraulic 2 is amber. 2. Crosswind from the south, 22, gusting 30. I'm going to need a crab and kick on short final. 3. Wet runway, reduced braking action. 4. This is my first real ILS approach in weather. I have never done this outside a simulator. 5. Landing weight estimated 68,500 pounds. VREF 135. Plus 15 for partial flaps equals 150 over the threshold. A beat.
Brandon, Walker said. That's all 5. You didn't miss one.
Thank you, sir.
Son?
Yes, sir.
You're going to land this airplane. Brandon did not answer. He could feel his hands beginning to shake on the yoke. Not a lot. Not enough that anyone else would see it. Enough that he could. Walker heard the tremor come through the open mic, because Walker had 35 years of hearing things pilots did not mean for him to hear.
Brandon, breathe with me, son. 4 in. Hold 4. 4 out. Hold 4. Count out loud. Go. 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold. 4, 3, 2, 1. Out. 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold. Again. They did it twice. Brandon's hands settled. His shoulders came down half an inch. Okay, sir. I'm good. You were always good, son. Behind him, Catherine said, 8.3. In the cabin, Maria had started the brace briefing. She walked the aisle, slowly, one hand on each seat back, and she said the same words she had said in training every year for 8 years. Head against the seat in front of you, feet flat on the floor, arms crossed over your thighs. You will feel a firm touchdown. Do not unbuckle until you are told. Sarah Brown held Lily tighter. She did not cry. Her mother had taught her that babies read their mother's face before they read their mother's words, and Lily was going to land with a calm mother. In the cockpit, Brandon began the approach briefing, out loud, for George in the jump seat and for himself. ILS, runway 28, frequency 110.3, inbound course 281, decision altitude 800 feet. Missed approach. Climb runway heading to 3000. Turn left heading 180. Proceed to clump and hold. Gear down at Tuglo. Flaps 20. Landing lights on. Auto brakes max. Spoilers armed. Good briefing, George said. Granddad wrote the ILS brief on page 41, Brandon said. He said the runway doesn't care what you meant to do, only what you do in the last 10 feet. George closed his eyes for a second. Kid, your granddad was a hell of a man. Yes, sir, he was. At 12,000 feet, the CRJ 700 entered the top of the overcast. The windscreen went gray, then white, then gray again. Brandon lost the horizon. He looked down at the attitude indicator, the way his grandfather's notebook said on page 14, and he flew by the instruments and not by his stomach. George keyed the cabin PA because Brandon asked him to, because Brandon could not take his hands off the yoke. This is George Davis. I am a retired Delta mechanic. I'm in the cockpit jump seat. Our pilot for this landing is Brandon Williams. He is 11 years old. He has 6,500 hours in a CRJ simulator. He knows this airplane better than most people I flew with for 32 years. He is going to land us. You are going to help him by being very quiet. Brace position in 3 minutes. The cabin went still. 3 miles out, Brandon's hands stopped shaking. Before I tell you what the next 12 minutes looked like, and the only pilot on the plane is 11. And he just whispered, page 41, like it was a prayer. The outer marker came at 2,200 feet above sea level. The localizer needle was dead center. The glide slope was alive, a hair high, settling. Brandon tapped the vertical speed down another 100 feet per minute, and the glide slope diamond slid home. Airspeed 152. Tom, outer marker, gear down, flaps 20, landing checklist. Roger, son. Cleared ILS runway 28, towers waiting. Brandon pulled the gear handle. The thump of the landing gear, dropping through the slipstream, ran up through the floor of the cockpit like a heartbeat. 3 green lights on the indicator. He toggled flaps to 20.
The airspeed nudged back toward 150. Gear 3 green. Flaps 20, 20. Spoilers armed. Auto brakes max. Landing checklist complete. Copy, son. 2 miles from the threshold. Tower sees you on the scope. 8.3, Catherine said. Thank you, ma'am. The clouds were still wrapped around the airplane like wet wool. Brandon called altitude every 100 feet, in the same soft voice he had used in his bedroom 1,000 mornings for 5 years. 2,000. 19. 18. 16. 15. Copy, son. 14. 13. 12. 11. 1,000. 2208. Runway in sight at minimums? Looking. 900. 800. Asphalt. It came through the mist, like a promise somebody had made to his grandfather in 1985, and never unmade. Dark, wet, edged in white, centerline lights stabbing through the rain. Runway 28 at Cherry Capital Airport, Traverse City, Michigan. 6,500 feet of concrete, and for the next 90 seconds, it was the only piece of earth in the world that mattered. Runway in sight. Landing. Copy, son. Wind 220 at 25. Brandon felt the airplane yaw as the crosswind pushed his tail. He crabbed 12 degrees to the right. The nose pointed off into the weather. His wing pointed at the runway. 200 feet. 100. 50. 30. He kicked. Left rudder to straighten the nose. Right aileron into the wind to stop the drift. The airplane aligned with the center line like a kid walking into his own kitchen. 20 feet. 10. The main gear touched. One firm thump. A small bounce. Settled clean. The nose wheel came down 2 seconds later. Brandon's hand went to the thrust levers. He pulled them to idle. He pulled them past idle into reverse. The engines roared against themselves behind him, and the airplane began to slow, because he had pulled the levers the way his forearms had pulled them 10,000 times in his bedroom in Detroit. Reverse deployed. The runway edge lights began to slide past the side window. 150 knots, 120, 90, 60 knots, out of reverse, 40, 30, taxi speed. 2208, clear the active, taxiway Alpha 3, brakes set. There was silence on the frequency for half a second. Then the tower controller at Cherry Capital, a man named Frank Dawson, who would never forget this shift for the rest of his life, said, in a voice that broke 3 words in. 2208, welcome home, son. Taxi to the gate. We've got everyone waiting for you. Brandon set the parking brake. His knees gave out. He did not fall, because the seat held him, but his legs would not hold his weight. He knew it would be a while before they did again. That was all right. There was nothing left for his legs to do. In the cabin, nothing happened for about 4 seconds. Then Sarah Brown lifted Lily over her head, like an offering, like she needed the baby to see with her own eyes the boy who had done this. Catherine Anderson slid down the cockpit doorway to the floor and did not try to stand up. Daniel Miller put his face in his hands. Peter Johnson was holding onto the seat back in front of him and repeating, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," to no one in particular. Maria Brooks was laughing and crying at the same time. George Davis was on his knees in the jump seat, head bowed, and his lips were moving in a prayer he had not said since his brother's funeral. Brandon unbuckled. Slowly. His fingers were trembling now, for the first time in 90 minutes. He climbed down out of the captain's seat, and he walked the 5 steps back to the galley floor, where Captain Wilson lay under a blanket and First Officer Taylor lay under another, side by side. He knelt between them. He did not touch either of them. He folded his hands in his lap. Captain Wilson, First Officer Taylor. The microphone on the cockpit panel behind him was still open. Tom Walker, at his station in Sector 23 at the Minneapolis ARTCC, stopped breathing. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more," Brandon said. "I kept them alive. I tried. Thank you for what you did before. Thank you for the airplane." He bowed his head. Tom Walker put his headset down on the console and covered his face with both hands. His supervisor, a man named Barry, came around the corner of the cubicle and did not say a word. 24 other controllers who had been listening on the frequency stood up from their own stations across the room, and the whole sector was silent for 30 seconds, which, if you know anything about an air route traffic control center, is a thing that never happens. Then the paramedics boarded Delta Connection 2208. They confirmed what everyone already knew about the two people under the blankets. They removed them with the blankets still in place, without lifting, so that no passenger would see what was there. They did this because George Davis had radioed ahead and told them to. The passengers deplaned in silence. They walked past the cockpit door one by one. Every one of them looked in. Every one of them saw the small boy in the grape-stained hoodie sitting on the cockpit floor, holding his own elbows. Brandon walked off last. A Delta Gate agent named Patricia met him at the end of the jet bridge. Her face was streaked. "Son," she said, "your grandmother is on the phone." He took it. He stood there in the fluorescent light of Gate 3 at Cherry Capital Airport, and he listened to his grandmother cry, 1,200 miles away in a dental office she was supposed to be cleaning. "Baby," she said, "you did it." He looked at his own hands. There was a smudge of whiteboard marker on his right thumb from school the day before. He had forgotten to wash it off. "Granddad," he said, very quietly, so that only his grandmother on the phone could hear. "I did it. I kept the promise." The press conference was 4 days later at the FAA Great Lakes Regional Office in Des Plaines, Illinois. Brandon wore a borrowed Navy suit, 2 sizes too large. The shoulders fell past his shoulders. His grandmother had pinned the cuffs up with 2 safety pins. She sat next to him in the first row. On the dais with him, Thomas Walker, 2 weeks from retirement and wearing a tie for the first time in a decade. Ellen Wilson, Captain Wilson's widow, 56 years old, her hair freshly braided by her daughter that morning. Grace Taylor Bennett, Jennifer Taylor's mother, 62, holding a small black velvet jewelry box in both hands. 2 chairs on the end of the dais stood empty, with the uniform jackets of the captain and the first officer folded over their backs. No flags, no bugles. This was not a funeral. It was an accounting. The NTSB regional administrator read the preliminary finding aloud. A crack in a bleed air valve on the number 2 engine of Delta Connection 2208, approximately 1/4 of an inch long, had allowed combustion byproducts, principally carbon monoxide, to enter the cockpit environmental system during climb. The 2 flight crew members had been rendered unconscious within approximately 6 minutes of exposure and had expired within 12. The report went on. It used technical language for half a page. Then, in the final paragraph, the administrator read a sentence that would be quoted in every aviation textbook published in the following decade. The subject minor passenger demonstrated airmanship and airmanship-adjacent cognitive function, materially exceeding commercial certificate standards. Ellen Wilson spoke first. She stood up. She unfolded a sheet of paper. She looked at Brandon across the dais. "My husband's insurance policy paid out on Friday," she said. "I've spoken with my daughters. We've established the Wilson Family Fund. It will cover the mortgage on a new 3-bedroom house for Brandon and his grandmother in a Detroit neighborhood of their choosing, and it will pay for all of Ruth's medical care for the rest of her life. My husband was a captain because he loved the responsibility. He would have wanted his seat to go to the boy who finished the flight." She sat down. Ruth, in the first row, put her hand over her mouth and did not take it down for 20 minutes. Grace Taylor Bennett stood up next. She opened the velvet jewelry box. Inside, on navy satin, lay a pair of small, silver first officer wings. They had been pinned to Jennifer Taylor's uniform shirt on the morning of the flight. "These were my daughter's first pair," Grace said. "She earned them at Mesa State in Grand Junction when she was 23. She kept them in a drawer. I want you to have them, Brandon, but I want you to promise me something." "Yes, ma'am." "Don't wear them. Not yet. You put them on the day you get your own, not before." "Yes, ma'am. I promise." Thomas Walker stood up. He did not have a prepared statement. He had a headset in his hand. A black Plantronics headset, 35 years old, with sweat stains on the foam and a coiled cord that had been coiled and uncoiled 10,000 times. "I wore this on the day your grandfather would have been proudest of you," he said. "You'll want something in your jump seat bag someday that has been there before. Take it." Brandon took it. He held it in both hands like it was made of eggshells. Catherine Anderson spoke from the floor, without a microphone. "I will not be taking the dais today," she said. "I didn't earn it, but I've established a foundation. I've funded it personally with $2.5 million. It will provide simulator rigs, instruction hours, and scholarships to middle schoolers in Detroit who want to learn to fly. It will be called the Ruth Williams Aviation Foundation." She turned to Ruth. "Because Ruth made the pilot, and because I was wrong." Ruth nodded. She did not speak. She did not have to. Delta Airlines announced Brandon's sponsorship a day later. Private pilot license upon reaching the minimum legal age. Full tuition at Purdue University's professional pilot program. CRJ 900 type rating upon graduation. A guaranteed first interview slot at Endeavor Air at age 23. A signing bonus held in escrow. EAA. Young Eagles renamed their scholarship for middle school aviators. It is now called the Williams Skyways Award, and it will be funded in perpetuity. George Davis, the retired mechanic from 14D, built Brandon a full-motion home simulator rig in the basement of the new house. 6 screens, authentic CRJ yoke, rudder pedals, parts donated by 30 of his former colleagues at the Tech Ops hangar in Atlanta. Completion took 82 days. Peter Johnson flew to Detroit with his wife. He left a medical alert bracelet on Ruth's kitchen table. "To say," the small card attached read, "that you are never invisible to me again." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the new house from the Historical Support Office of the United States Air Force. Staff Sergeant Elijah Williams's service record had been reviewed. He had been due, at the time of his discharge in 1988, 3 commendations that had been delayed in the administrative backlog of the period. Among them, the Meritorious Service Medal for his conduct as a crew chief on combat resupply missions during a classified period of operations. Ruth opened the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She walked into the living room. She pinned the medal on the wall above the stove, where a cross had hung. At the press conference, Brandon had spoken for 90 seconds. He had thanked his grandmother. He had thanked Thomas Walker. He had named Captain Wilson and First Officer Taylor once each, slowly, the way you name people who have given you something you can never give back. And he had said, "My granddad used to tell me that altitude is a promise. I want to help keep it. For kids like me, and for the crews who didn't come home." That night, back in Detroit, Ruth made him a grilled cheese sandwich at the old kitchen table in the old apartment. "Baby, 5th grade Monday?" "Yes, ma'am." He went. The new house has 3 bedrooms and a basement that smells like fresh electrical solder. Brandon's room is on the 2nd floor. The window faces east, toward the airport. On the wall above his new desk, Ruth hung the water-stained piece of ceiling from the old apartment, the patch shaped like the state of Michigan, inside a thrift store picture frame. She said it was important. She said a map of where you came from is worth more than a map of where you are going. Tom Walker's Plantronics headset sits on the corner of the desk. Inside a small glass case, on a bookshelf by the bed, rests a pair of silver first officer wings that Brandon has promised not to wear yet. Downstairs, above the stove, an Air Force Meritorious Service Medal hangs where a cross once hung. And on the desk, open to a new page, is a pencil-written spiral notebook held together with Scotch tape. How to Talk to a Tower. Brandon has added a single line underneath his grandfather's final entry. The date is 4 days after the landing. The handwriting is his own. First real flight. Logged. B. Williams, age 11. Outside, through the window, a contrail crosses the Detroit sky and turns slowly pink in the evening light. Brandon Williams was never the boy nobody expected. He was the boy nobody bothered to ask. If this story reminded you that small hands can hold the sky, A quick subscribe is how you tell us to keep finding the kids nobody bothered to ask. Someone you know needs to hear this tonight.